Okay, this is Block 6, the Great Depression, Section 3, Franklin Roosevelt and the election in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt holds a unique place in American history. He is the only president to serve more than 2 terms. He is the only president to be elected 4 times. He is one of 8 presidents to die in office. He is widely considered by historians to be one of the top 3 presidents in American history. In my opinion, he is definitely a top 5. He is the most important American of the 20th century, as Lincoln was the most important American of the 19th and Washington of the 18th. He changes the American government and changes American culture in many, many ways. Roosevelt was born into a very wealthy, old New York family in 1882. The Roosevelts and the Delanos, that was his middle name, Delano, the Delanos. The Roosevelts and the Delanos had been, they were of Dutch extraction and had lived and farmed along the Hudson River north of New York City for generations, and they were incredibly wealthy landowners. He was a 6th cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, and when he was young, he did not show much in the way of aptitude for anything. No one considered him particularly intelligent. No one considered him particularly bright. He was tall. He was very handsome. He was very athletic. He was definitely a ladies' man. He went to an exclusive preparatory high school, where the sons of important families went. He went to Harvard for undergrad. He went to Columbia Law School and dropped out after he passed the bar exam, and practiced law without any spectacular successes, as a young man in New York City. In 1920, no, not 19, it's earlier than that. In the early 1900s, he married his cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt's niece, and at Franklin and Eleanor's wedding, Teddy Roosevelt gave the bride away. Eleanor and Franklin did not share a close marriage. Franklin Roosevelt was a philanderer. He slept with pretty much anything he could find. Eleanor wanted to divorce him, but Franklin's mother kind of paid her off not to. That divorcing her husband would have meant the end of Franklin's political career, really before it even got started. Eleanor Roosevelt also, in all likelihood, was a lesbian, and although they had several children, their marriage was largely loveless, and it was largely a political marriage, one of America's most famous political marriages. She is an incredibly important asset to her husband politically. They respected each other politically, although they certainly didn't love each other romantically. Franklin Roosevelt begins his political career. He uses his family connections to get himself a seat in the New York State House. In the 19-teens, he is a progressive. He wins election to the New York State Senate, where he fought for progressive causes, including against the New York City machine, Tammany Hall. He makes himself very popular as a progressive reformer in the capital of Albany. He is appointed Assistant Secretary of War during World War I, and his energy in this post leads him, to become a rising star in the Democratic Party. Although Roosevelt was not the most brilliant of men, he was an incredibly canny politician. He was gregarious, he was friendly, people liked him, he was a mover and a shaker, he got things done. If anyone said anything was kind of holding him back from higher office, it was his arrogance. It was the arrogance of youth, the arrogance of wealth, the arrogance of privilege. Roosevelt was, considered by all to be an arrogant man, even though he fought for all of the quote-unquote right progressive causes. In 1920, Roosevelt was nominated as the vice president on the Democratic ticket of John W. Davis, and when John W. Davis went down in defeat to Harding, Vice President Roosevelt, who came out of the campaign looking just fine, went back to New York and continued his political career there. In 1921, something happened that changed Roosevelt's life forever. While vacationing in Rhode Island, he fell ill. For a long time, doctors and historians have assumed that what Roosevelt came down with was childhood polio, that he got childhood polio as an adult. More modern medical research has put out the theory that is now becoming widely accepted that it was not polio at all, but that, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Guillain-Barré syndrome was what Roosevelt had. Well, whatever he had, whether it was Guillain-Barré or whether it was polio, it left Franklin Roosevelt permanently paralyzed below the waist. And this formerly strong, athletic, dashing young man could now not walk without the aid of braces or a wheelchair. This changed Roosevelt's personality. He was determined, more than anything in the world, to one day walk again. And he fought his body every day for the rest of his life in an attempt to walk uselessly. He developed he knew that no politician in America could ever succeed if he was seen to be as a cripple. So Franklin Roosevelt came up with many ingenious ways to hide the fact that he was significantly physically disabled. He was outfitted, his legs were useless, and the muscles in them wasted away. He was fitted with a pair of very strong braces that allowed his legs to stand upright when he held himself in that position. There are very, very few pictures of Franklin Roosevelt in his braces actually walking, and you can tell that he's obviously physically handicapped. He developed an incredible upper body strength that he could use his arms and his torso and his shoulders to pretty much support, the weight of his body because his legs couldn't. He even developed a way to walk after a fashion of kind of just picking up one side of his body and putting it down, and then picking up the other side of his body and putting it down. And with assistance from his sons, they all worked out together. That what happened would be Roosevelt would stand, on the arm of one of his sons, big, strong boys, and his son would just hold his forearm out. And they all worked out together that the son's forearm was strong enough to support the weight of Roosevelt pressing down on it. And the reason for that was Roosevelt wanted to look strong and capable and able and, like a politician wants to. And the press was friendly with Roosevelt, and the press made it a point never to take pictures of him or video of him, in a wheelchair. There are very few pictures of Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair that exist. There is only one video in existence of him doing his funny little walk. That the press, said to Roosevelt, okay, we'll only portray you in ways physically that you wish to be portrayed. And everyone knew that he was physically handicapped at some degree, somehow, but the degree of his paralysis was never known by the American people. Although he worked out every day and did all sorts of treatments and theories to get his legs to work again. Lived in constant fear of fire because he couldn't, jump out of bed and run to the door. The physical handicap changed him mentally as well. The arrogance was gone, and in its place was a determination and an appreciation for struggle that made him able to connect with the struggle of ordinary Americans in ways that he never had been able to before. Even though his class background, was of extreme wealth and privilege, the physical handicap that he suffered through and fought till literally to the day he died. The day he died, he was at a hot springs in Georgia trying a new treatment on his legs. The change in personality made him a much better politician. It made him able to connect with the struggling people of the United States. Roosevelt spent about 7 years out of the political spotlight, recovering from his illness. Because the illness, it was severe in ways besides just the paralysis in his legs. You know, he had temporary blindness, he had temporary paralysis of the throat, and after everything kind of all cleared away, he was fine mentally and physically, except, of course, for the below-the-waist paralysis. But in 1928, he kind of burst back on the scene and got himself elected as governor of New York. Back then, governors only served a term of 2 years, and Roosevelt was re-elected to the governorship of New York in 1930 by a rather overwhelming margin. By 1930, the country was in the depths of the Depression, and the Democrats kind of tasted victory in the White House. And when the election of 1932 rolled around, there was no question on anybody's mind that the Democratic Party would nominate Franklin Roosevelt to be President of the United States. And Roosevelt broke with tradition. He breaks with tradition in so many different ways. Before Roosevelt, when a candidate was nominated, he stayed at home. And it was considered unbecoming to the office of the president to actively campaign, to go to the convention yourself. It was considered beneath a politician. During all the nominating conventions that had come before, none of the actual men nominated ever were there. All of the backroom deals and nitty-gritty of the politics was left up to their surrogates, left up to their assistants, their supporters. But after Roosevelt was nominated, he took the unprecedented step of flying to the convention himself. He was, he was brought onto stage. He walked onto the stage on the arms of his sons, and he just whipped the crowd into this frenzy. And the election of 1932 was on, one of the most lopsided elections in American history, which we're going to take a look at next. That is Franklin Roosevelt. A brief look at his history. He's a fascinating person, a fascinating character. How a person of average intelligence, but an incredible personality, tempered by illness, sharpened by disease, rose to be the most important American of the 20th century.